interesting ideas, the policy level and the use case-centric approach. Michał will now talk about the financial sector and show how these could begin to be linked together.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you a couple of stories. I'll not be really talking very much about the ISA² framework or the interoperability levels. I think that has been covered quite nicely by my colleagues. Instead, I'll share with you a couple of those very practical insights about someone who has been working on the other side, trying to connect to a variety of the public administration services, or in my case, largely with the financial services regulators. One story comes to mind when I was listening particularly to Carsten. 12 years ago, 13 years ago, I was working in the International Accounting Standards Board in London, and we were trying to build interoperability with our American colleagues between the principle-driven European international financial reporting standards and rule-based driven generally accepted accounting principles of the US. And our chairman of the ISB, Sir David Tweedy, he came forward in one conference and said, you know what, about this interoperability between this principle-driven IFRSs on the European soil and the rule-driven on the US, I don't think it's going to work out. And I think it's primarily because Europeans follow no rules and Americans recognize no principles. So I think that we have some practical things to tackle, really. And on these practical things, let me share with you, I'll try to see if it works. I will use experience of some bodies which I have an honor to work with. The Eurofining Foundation, which is trying to bridge regulators across Europe, share practices, help them advance in certain technological policies, data areas and initiatives. XBL International, which is a standards body, and it's basically advancing the understanding of data on the business reporting layer. So wherever, for instance, companies need to report financial reports, such as SMEs to their business registries or listed companies in the particular countries. Another is the ISO organization, the Technical Committee 68, which is advancing the adoption of so-called ISO 20022 standards. I'll use these experiences to basically tell you a couple of those stories which I think illustrate how interoperability works in practice. And here is one story particularly which I like. Colleagues from DG FISMA, Peter van den Hoe, at some point of time, they started looking across regulation that defines the rules for capital markets, banking, insurance entities, pension funds, pretty much everything that defines the digital, the single market, the European single market, capital market. We started looking at those rules, and Peter and his team identified a number of frameworks across the European legislation. These were approximately 50 frameworks that constituted the legal body that defined the rules, defined the data requirements, defined the way how these companies had to basically interact, play according to the ways how we wanted to see them in the European Union. 23 of these frameworks were so-called structured data frameworks. There were different national implementations in some cases of these frameworks. There were, according to the Lamfalussy process, there were level 1 directives, regulations, there were level 2, on level 1 there were delegated acts as well, on level 2 there were all these implementing technical standards, regulatory technical standards, on level 3 there were guidelines, and all of that constituted the way how all these interactions between the market and between the regulators in this case worked out. Some of these organizations, obviously on the market, like large banks or large insurance providers, they were working in and with the different public administrations, different financial regulators across these European countries. So obviously a big bank would be interacting with regulators in several member states and also with the EU federal regulators such as the supervisory agencies like ESMA, EIOPA, EBA, the central bank, obviously the European Central Bank, and others. There are also in this space in financial services, we've got international regulators. We've got the BIS, the Bank for International Settlement. We've got IOSCO for securities organizations. We've got some others, IAIS and others, which I'll basically, which it is important to take them into account in this entire picture. They create the ecosystem. Altogether, we've got thousands of entities. We've got 3,500 insurance entities, we've got banking institutions, we've got issuers, we've got pension funds, we've got over 25,000 pages of regulations only in those frameworks that were taken into account by the Financial Data Standardization Project that I mentioned that is run by DG FISMA. 1,500 documents, 300 plus reporting obligations that we are talking about, data point models, different standards, different identifiers, and on top of that, challenging institutions like the fintech and the regtech institutions, which basically go around the legal regulations. And there are multiple problems which appear across these regulations. These problems are very similar to those that we've been talking about in the public administration. We've got 10 ways to define very simple thing, annual frequency of reporting. We've got 11 identifiers, 33, if I remember correctly, identifiers to identify different things across the financial regulation. We've got tens of ways in which lawyers and business experts in each of these organizations across the EU describe their rules. It is hardly possible to imagine that this is an interoperable, any kind of framework. Now, what we see as a potential here, we observe that if you take it holistically, if you take it from the ISA² perspective, if you look at the organization, if you look at the legal, if you take it the technical, if you technological, and if you take a look at the semantic, you are able to put together those pieces. And various use cases here illustrate how those pieces work. One particular use case I would like to bring is, for instance, the European Financial Transparency Gateway project, which is run currently by Mario's team and Emmanuel's team on the DGIT. It originated also on the FISMA side. It is about using blockchain whenever the legal framework doesn't allow the parties to cooperate together. Blockchain is used for the distributed, so to say, connection between the registries. And there are multiple of these use cases that we could bring, but I see that the time is pretty much up. So to allow for a bit of a panel session, I would like to conclude with one thing. Around 10 years ago, I was asked by the Australian government, we flew over to Canberra, and they asked us about how can we spearhead interoperability? How can we actually solve some problems of the companies reporting to the different agencies? So we are sitting in a room. There are major agencies there, ATO, the Tax Office, ASIC, the Securities Commission, ABS, the Bureau of Statistics, some sort of local state government agencies as well, and APRA, which is the Prudential Regulation Authority. Each of them brought to the table their way of working. Each of them brought to the table their legal frameworks. And it really required an overarching mandate, which was introduced in Australia by means of the Australian Treasury. There was a gentleman who was basically empowered to say to each of these agencies, we respect your legal frameworks, but here's how it's going to be done. The result, in 2010, Australia implemented pan-government program in order to advance the reduction of burdens for the businesses and for the citizens in all the government to business and government to citizen interactions. 2015, 2016, they realized savings for these businesses estimated at 1.2 billion Australian dollars. So I think that pretty much shows why we are working for this interoperability aspects. With that, I would like to conclude and allow for the panel to start. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.